Well, it's great to be here, and I want to thank the BABCP committee for inviting me. It's been a great conference. I know it's a kind of a short one by Canadian or American standards. I should say American standards, because ABCT usually goes, I think, 3 days or 3.5 days. But 2 days, and I have heard some terrific papers, really top-notch research that's being done here. And what I like about it is there's so much clinical relevance in even some of the more experimental, or what I would think maybe a little more basic kind of research, but there's always a lot of clinical implication to the work that you're doing. And I know I can tell you this, that in other parts of the world, we look at the UK as a leader when it comes to CBT, and when it comes to CBT training and research, and, the IAP program, but not only the IAP program, a lot of other fine work, excellent work is being done here. So I can tell you in all truthfulness, it's a little bit intimidating being here and, kind of presenting some of my own work. So thank you for inviting me. Now, what I want to do is explain my title, because I realize that, I submitted the title, and then I'm thinking today, why did I say another neglected transdiagnostic concept? Like, why did I ever say another neglected? And in a sense, I'm not suggesting that we have a whole list of neglected concepts, but what I was trying to capture is we often don't think of intrusive thoughts as having much relevance beyond OCD. So what I'd like to do today is to suggest to you that the idea of an intrusive thought has relevance for many different types of conditions. And certainly of great relevance to worry, PTSD, and OCD, but even more broadly than that. There are a couple of things I want to do with this talk. One is to introduce the idea that intrusive thoughts are normal, and I'll be looking at a little bit of kind of basic research on spontaneous thought and situating intrusive thoughts within that broader context of spontaneous, or what we call stimulus-independent thought. Also want to suggest to you that it's not the occurrence of the thought, but it's how we respond to the thought that's most critical. So I'll be showing you some research that we've been doing on the appraisals or significance of intrusions, and then also following up with some research on mental control, or attempts to control the thought. So those are the two big components to what we think is a problem when it comes to intrusive thoughts, which is how you appraise the thought or evaluate it, and attempts to actually control the thought. So let's get started, and the first thing I want to do is try to get the slide moving. There we go. Okay, so I first want to acknowledge some graduate students from the past who have been involved in this. You might see, particularly Christine Purdon, think, really? She was a grad student at some point? But she was, and in fact, she was one of my first students to really drill into this whole notion of intrusive thoughts. And of course, had some funding over the years. Whoops, okay. I'll get used to this thing eventually. The other acknowledgement I want to make at the beginning is a group of researchers I've worked with in the last few years, and we call ourselves it's like an international research consortium, and it really composes of 15 researchers from 13 countries, and we've done some work on intrusive thoughts from more of an international perspective. Later on, I'll explain some of the research, some of the data that we collected in this international group. Now, this is one of the reasons I present this slide is I like to kind of situate intrusive thoughts within the bigger picture. So if we think about intrusive thoughts, we can think about the different cognitive concepts from the point of view of, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but at the top here, we would have what we call just thoughts. Beck called them negative automatic thoughts. This is a kind of thought that pops into your mind, or you might even try to think about it. And mental intrusions or intrusive thoughts are situated, let's say, at that, I hate to use the word surface and deep, but I think you know what I mean, what I'm trying to get at. And we have interventions that kind of focus in at this immediate thought level. And we can work with intrusions at that level, mindfulness, and acceptance and commitment therapy will all more or less focus at this level of the thought and, let's say, the appraisal of the thought. But of course, we want to recognize that there are also intermediate beliefs, and then we have what Judy Beck and probably others would call core beliefs, and Jeff Young's schema-focused therapy would supposedly, or I say supposedly, it certainly tries to focus at this sort of schema level. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is this upper level, but just to let you know that I recognize that that's not the only level that we need to work at when it comes to the cognitive basis of clinical conditions. So let's start with the notion of the normality of intrusions. And if, in fact, intrusions are normal, then obviously what we want to do as clinicians is to help our patients to accept intrusions as they are. So what is an intrusion? You say, well, this is a kind of a definition. There are several definitions. But you'll see that the idea of an intrusion is it's a distinct thought. It's not a chain of thinking. It's not a cognitive theme. It's a specific, distinct thought that, let's say, pops into the mind. It's not wanted necessarily in the fact that you're not trying to have the thought. It just enters consciousness. It's unintended, and it could be recurrent. Often in clinical disorders, the same intrusive thought will come back again and again. The thought interrupts the flow of thought. In other words, you pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention to the intrusive thought and it doesn't interrupt your functioning, then I guess it's not a problem, is it? But the intrusive thoughts in clinical disorders obviously interrupt the flow of thought. They interrupt task performance, and it's often associated with negative affect. And we can think of a variety of certainly in OCD, a lot of the intrusive thoughts have to do with harm and dirt and doubt and disease and so forth. But in depression, we could have intrusive thoughts of failure. Thought could pop into your mind, I'm going to fail, or I am failing. I could have an intrusive thought right now, you all look rather bored, or something to that effect, right? That wouldn't be an obsessive thought, that would be more of a depressive intrusive thought. We can have anxious thoughts as well, intrusion thoughts. Think in social anxiety. If a person with social anxiety enters a social situation, the intrusive thought might be, people are staring at me, or I look a bit different or odd, or I sound different. Well, I guess I do sound different, don't I? But, that would be the intrusive thought. And, of course, in PTSD, the intrusive thought may be something about a trauma. So we can see that these intrusive thoughts can happen, can occur across disorders. The interesting thing, I started my work and interest in intrusive thoughts purely from a clinical perspective, and yet there is a very strong neurophysiological basis for the notion of intrusive thoughts or spontaneous thinking. And some of the work that has been done from the neuroscience perspective suggests that spontaneous thought is so common that it's actually been referred to as the brain's default mode of operation. We can't help but think spontaneously. And in fact, often it's very difficult to get any kind of consistency in some of the neuroimaging studies, but when it comes to spontaneous thought, there's a fair degree of of consensus that spontaneous thought arises in the medial prefrontal cortex, in the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial temporal lobe, and the bilateral inferior parietal lobe. So it's, there is a neurological basis to this, as well as acknowledgement that often in the kind of the stream of consciousness or consciousness literature that spontaneous thinking is very normal. Now, obviously, spontaneous thoughts can be positive, they can be negative, and they can be benign, rather irrelevant. Of course, the stuff that we're interested in as clinicians are the more negative intrusions. And negative intrusions are implicated in what we now refer to as repetitive negative thought, which would be like worry, rumination, post-event processing, and so on. So some of this work, which is kind of more or less outside the clinical area, suggests that intrusions are very normal. And in fact, intrusions are very adaptive. We have to be able to think spontaneously. That spontaneous thought is certainly a key feature of creativity and divergent thinking. It's helpful in problem solving. It's linked to human flourishing or well-being. And it's helpful in planning as well and forethought of future tasks. So we need to be able to think spontaneously. It's good to have intrusive thoughts, right? And so the clinical implication, of course, is for our patients when they come in and they say, I don't want to have these intrusive thoughts, it's, well, you can't help that. That's how your brain operates. Now, intrusive thoughts, interestingly, intrusive thinking is not only connected with the disorder side or the clinical condition side, but there is some evidence that intrusive thinking can actually be helpful for recovery. And in this particular study that done by Brooks et al., just published, you can see the reference there, what they did is they looked at post-traumatic growth. Now, not post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic growth in individuals who had at least one trauma. Now, this was an online survey, so they had people who at least had one trauma, and they had different measures. Now, the problem with this study is that their measures of intrusive thoughts was more or less mixed in with their PTSD-type measure. But they had 8 items that measured intrusive thoughts. And what's interesting is they found through regression correlation analysis, mainly regression analysis, that individuals who reported more intrusive thinking were better at overcoming the effects of the trauma. That intrusive thoughts mediated the relationship between the trauma and post-traumatic growth. So here we see evidence that intrusions can actually be helpful in recovery. It's not always harmful. Now, so what we can, this particular study I find, which is fascinating, is by Morewedge and colleagues. What's interesting about this study is this is from the social cognition research or area. And so we're looking at individuals, non-clinical individuals, and this particular paper reports on 5 studies to look at what people believe about spontaneous thoughts. Now, this is not a study on how people appraise or interpret spontaneous thinking. This is what people believe about spontaneous thought. And that the finding is that individuals have a tendency to believe that spontaneous thinking is more meaningful than effortful thinking. So spontaneous thinking is more meaningful than effortful thinking. So let me show you some of their studies. In the first study, they had 191, I think these were university students, usually they are university students, who rated 13 types of thoughts. And so the categories of thoughts were intrusive thoughts, deliberate thinking, mind wandering, daydreaming, and so on. And then they asked them to rate how meaningful or insightful they thought that particular type of thinking would be. And there was a strong correlation analysis that the more spontaneous the thought category, the more individuals rated it as revealing something insightful or meaningful about them. So then that was kind of that was their first basic study. Then they followed that up with a second study with 201, again, I think college students who were asked to recall a pleasant or an unpleasant childhood event, and they rated the extent to which it was meaningful. And if the person recalled the childhood event more spontaneously, the individual thought it was more meaningful. So if it took more effort to recall the childhood event, then it was less meaningful to them. In the third study, participants generated impressions to a picture of a stranger, either spontaneously or they were to kind of deliberately and logically evaluate the picture. And again, when the evaluation was done spontaneously, the respondents or the participants rated the impression as more meaningful to them. And fourth study, which I particularly think is interesting, is they were instructed to think randomly or deliberately about a person to whom they were attracted to. So this is kind of like physical attraction. And it had to be someone other than the person you're with now, like your current partner or boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever. And individuals who spontaneously generated a thought believed it was more valid or revealed more about their true feelings towards that individual than people who more deliberate. In the final study, participants were asked to think of a positive or negative experience with the current partner. And again, if the retrieval was more spontaneous, they believed it was more insightful and meaningful about their relationship with their partner than if it was a more deliberate. If they had to generate that memory more deliberately. So what's important about these studies is there may be a built-in tendency for us to believe that spontaneous thinking is meaningful. So just think about that as clinicians for a moment. What that means is, irrespective of the clinical condition, when our patients come in and they're really buying into those intrusive thoughts, there's already an inherent tendency that we all kind of think that spontaneous thinking reveals something about who we are, right? And so as clinicians in therapy, what we're trying to do is override that tendency, say, well, it must be believable because it just popped into my mind, it's spontaneous. Now, I guess I've already told you this. So the clinical implication from this is, if spontaneous or intrusive thoughts are normal, we can't escape mental intrusions. You can't shut that off. Secondly, clearly then, if you can't shut down your intrusions, then acceptance has to be the goal of therapy. And thirdly, of course, as I've just mentioned, there's this natural tendency to endow mental spontaneity with meaning. So that makes our job as clinicians even more difficult. In case you were wondering whether acceptance was a new idea, there is a 34-year-old history to acceptance, and when I was coming over, I was reading some other stuff, and actually it's probably 3,000 or 4,000 years old in terms of acceptance, how old this concept is. But back in, if you look at Beck and Emery 1985, they had this little acronym called AWARE. And basically what they're saying is that in cognitive therapy for anxiety disorders, that the end goal is acceptance. Notice what the A is, accept the anxiety. Watch your anxiety, act with the anxiety, and I've kind of put in brackets, is that kind of fake it till you make it. In other words, act as if you can handle the anxiety. Act as if you weren't anxious. Now, I think they ran out of ideas because R is repeat the above steps. And I'm thinking, come on, guys. I mean, repeat the above steps. I mean, you got to come up. So I'm thinking maybe the R could be remember normalization. In other words, remember that anxiety is normal. Remember intrusive thoughts are normal, and so on. And then the E is expect the best. And they're saying have a positive expectancy that you're going to be able to handle the anxiety. So when we say that for intrusive thinking that the goal is acceptance, this is very, very consistent with the foundations of cognitive therapy or CBT, at least for anxiety. So what I want to present then is the idea that unwanted mental intrusions are transdiagnostic. And a lot of excellent work is being done here in the UK on transdiagnostic processes and protocols. And we see Warren Mansell and Ellison Harvey, well, Ellison is in California, but Ed Watkins and Roz and others have been working on this concept of transdiagnostic. In fact, I think Warren and his colleagues at Manchester now have a 6-session take control course, which is based on the notion of transdiagnostic processes, which is very interesting. So I think we all pretty well know what we're talking about when it comes to what we mean by transdiagnostic. I think in the end, we're not going to call it transdiagnostic anymore because diagnostic kind of has a dirty name right at the moment. So maybe we'll just call it common processes. Now, the first slide I want to present is kind of the beginning of our interest in intrusive thoughts as a possible transdiagnostic concept. And this was an old study that was first published in '78 by Rachman and Silva. And this got the whole interest in unwanted intrusive thoughts started. And this is where they took a look at they had 2 parts to their study. One part of the study was a survey of non-clinical individuals. They gave them a checklist of a whole bunch of different kinds of intrusive thoughts. A lot of them had OCD kind of themes to them, and they found that non-clinical people often had these intrusive thoughts. Then they took a subsample of that and compared 40 non-clinical, and they only had 8 OCD patients. And basically what you see in this particular slide is obviously the patients had a lot more of their unwanted intrusions, but the non-clinical actually had a fair number as well, 1 to 9 daily, 10 plus daily, so on. And so this was kind of a fairly remarkable finding at the time that you can find what they called normal intrusions in the population. We were a little bit, and then there were a whole host of studies, which I'm skipping over, a whole host of studies showing unwanted intrusive thoughts, negative intrusive thoughts, that is, in non-clinical samples. There were a couple of problems with these studies. First of all, often people mixed up intrusive thoughts. So they had not only OCD types of thoughts, they had worry, they had negative thoughts, and so on. A lot of it was based on questionnaires. And I've always had this suspicion, are people really that tuned into their thinking that they can make a distinction between what is an intrusive thought and what is an effortful thought? And so possibly the methodology is not very accurate. The final problem is just about all the research on intrusive thoughts was done either here in the UK or in Canada or the US. And so what about other parts of the world? What about other countries? What about other cultures? Do they have these kinds of intrusive thoughts? So we struck up Adam Radomski and I, we kind of collaborated with several other colleagues. We came up with this international intrusion study. And there are a couple of things we did here. First of all, you can see the countries that were represented. in this particular study. So we collected data in all, I think there's 15 countries, or 13 countries there, 13 countries. And some of them are not particularly interesting. I don't think Canada or the US is particularly interesting, but other countries, Argentina, Sierra Leone, Turkey, and so on, where there had never been any data collected on intrusive thought. So the second thing that we did is we developed a 128-page interview. And so instead of having questionnaires, giving out questionnaires, we actually interviewed all of our participants, and because we really wanted to see whether people have obsessive-like intrusive thoughts. And so then we also had some other questionnaires, which were kind of outcome measures. Oops, this is what we found. This was Adam's part of the project, so we put that together. This is the frequency of unwanted intrusive thoughts. So we had these different types of categories. So we had contamination intrusions, harm intrusions, doubt, religion and immorality, sexual victimization intrusions, and so on. And of course, all the different countries are represented. Now, trying to analyze data, this kind of data, is just about an impossibility. But there are a couple of things that are interesting that you can take from this. First of all, in every country, over 80% reported at least one unwanted, distressing, intrusive thought in the last 3 months. So when we really tried to be very, very specific on the type of intrusion, whether it was an OCD type of intrusion or it wasn't, we really worked hard on that. Even with that kind of more strict criteria, we were able to show that there's a cross-cultural phenomena here, that people from all countries will report intrusive thoughts. None of these people are clinical, right? This is a non-clinical sample. There were country differences in the content, but it didn't make any sense. In other words, I couldn't figure out. Some of the more religious countries didn't necessarily have more religious intrusions. It was kind of all over the place. It wasn't clear to understand the content, although there were some country differences. The other thing, though, that was interesting is that in every case, people reported appraisals and responses to, or control responses to the intrusions that were remarkably similar. There were very little country differences in how people were interpreting the intrusive thought or how they were responding to it. This is another follow-up study that was done by some colleagues in Spain, and this is comparing an OCD sample with community controls. And again, as you would expect, you can see a lot more of intrusions with the OCD sample than with the control, which is, of course, what you would expect. The OCD, they reported more intrusions. The average frequency in the OCD sample was once or twice a month, whereas the community, it was far, far less. Doubts, contamination, and superstition were the most common intrusions. The other thing that we've looked at is different types of life experiences. Would people who have had a certain type of negative life experience have more intrusions? And this is some data we collected not too long ago on couples or individuals who had experienced a romantic breakup. So these individuals had had and it was a serious kind of relationship that they were in. They weren't kind of, it was, you know, again, college students, but I think they had to be together for at least 3 months, and it had to be exclusive, and so on. And the interesting thing that we find from this is that when the sample was divided into the students who were highly distressed with the breakup and students with low distress, the big distinction was relationship intrusions. These were unwanted intrusive thoughts about your ex. So you can see that the distressed group had significantly more intrusive thoughts about the ex, unwanted intrusive thoughts about the ex, than the low distress group. And again, a different sample where we looked at, again, a breakup sample. You know, you broke up with your partner, but let's say then we fall and say, okay, if you broke up with your partner, how many were in a new relationship? So this would be this group here, you're in a serious new relationship, you kind of moved on, let's say, and this other group who are single. In other words, maybe they're stuck in the sense that the breakup is bothering them and so on. And again, what you see here that's interesting is the intrusive thoughts, that the single group who possibly are more upset by the breakup, not maybe adjusting quite as well, have more unwanted intrusive thoughts than the group that has kind of moved on to a new relationship. So there are a couple of things that we can take away from this. We know that intrusions, of course, are a core feature of OCD and in PTSD. There's some data showing that worry is often triggered by intrusive thoughts. And so you have a thought pop into your mind, and then the worry process starts. Intrusive thoughts are also cued in other anxiety disorders, health anxiety, and so on. And we now know that there's a fair amount of intrusive thinking in depression and dysphoria. And as I showed in the last couple of slides, we get it a lot of intrusive in major loss experiences like relationship breakup, John Abramowitz and Nicole Fairbrother, I should say, have shown an increase in intrusive thoughts in postpartum women, particularly mothers, first-time mothers, will show an increase in intrusive thoughts of harm towards the infant. So we know that life conditions, let's say clinical conditions, life experiences can drive intrusions. So why should we focus on intrusive thinking in our clinical practice? Well, one is it's prominent in emotional disturbance. Intrusive thinking and its management may contribute to distress. We know there's this bias to overinterpret into spontaneous thought, and there are probably individual differences in variables in intrusive thinking. So people maybe who are highly creative, high emotionality, cognitive self-consciousness may have more intrusive thoughts. And of course, intrusions probably reflect some schema congruency. So I'm going to quickly go through this particular part of the presentation because this will be well known to you, I'm sure. So what can we say about how people respond or interpret their intrusive thoughts? Well, first of all, it's well known that you can either interpret the occurrence of the thought, which is what we often happen in OCD. So, for example, with repugnant obsessions, it's the thought itself, it's having the thought pop in your mind that is considered problematic. In worry and in rumination, it's the content of the intrusive thought that's most important. Secondly, we know that in exaggerated appraisals of personal significance are important. There is some evidence that it's not only how the intrusion is interpreted, but also how you interpret the failure to control your thoughts. So let's take, for example, if a musical tune or something kind of pops in your head, you can't get out of your head. You've probably had that, right? The song kind of keeps playing over and over and over and over again. Probably you go, oh, well, that's annoying, but eventually it fades. It's not a big deal. The fact that you can't control it doesn't really bother you too much. But when we think with a lot of people, particularly in worry and OCD and so on, that people are very upset. They're very concerned about their failure to control the thought. So appraisals of failed control may be quite important. Avoidance and safety seeking, emotional reasoning, and heightened mental control efforts. These are all processes in terms of response to the intrusion that might be particularly important and a reason why, for some people, their intrusive thoughts are so persistent and repetitive and distressing. This, again, the types of faulty appraisals, this will be well known to you. This comes from the OCD literature, but it's probably of great relevance for any type of intrusive thought. So let's look a little bit at data, again going back to that international study where we looked at appraisals and control of thoughts. And so we took that massive data set. By the way, the N on that data was 777. Well, that's kind of a neat number, but it worked out 777 individuals who were given this in-depth interview on intrusive thoughts. When we did the analysis in terms of looking at faulty appraisals and control strategies, because people were asked to appraise, fill in appraisal ratings, let's say, for their most distressing intrusive thought, and also ways in which they tried to control the thought. The controlling the thought was divided into two categories, what we call confrontational strategies. And the confrontational strategies might be like seeking reassurance, trying to deal with the intrusive thought, rationalize it in some way. And the avoidance strategies were maybe distraction, try to suppress the thought, and so on. And when we looked at the data, what is particularly interesting in these regressions is that the appraisals, I'm just going to get to my notes here. The appraisals, yeah, here we go. The faulty appraisals significantly predicted the distress and uncontrollability of the intrusion. Not so much the frequency, but distress and uncontrollability. The confrontational strategies here, the confrontational strategies predicted the distress of the intrusion, but the avoidance strategies only predicted the uncontrollability. So what we can say is that the results suggest that appraisals are probably a bit more important in accounting for the distress and the uncontrollability of the intrusion than the actual control strategies used. This is again some data from the Amparo Belloc and from Spain. And again, she's looking at an OCD and a sample and a non-clinical kind of community sample. And this is where she's getting ratings on frequency, distress, appraisals, and so on. And the only thing to take away is very simple, is that you get strong differences in frequency, strong differences and significant differences on appraisal. Of course, with the OCD group appraising their intrusive thoughts in a more, let's say, pathological way, faulty way than the control group, less difference on control. So again, it looks like appraisal is more important. How the thought is appraised is more important than how you actually try to control it. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit on the appraisal side of unwanted intrusive thoughts. So let's look at the control side, because that is the other side of the coin. And of course, there is a bit of a paradox when it comes to mental control. And the paradox is this: the harder you try to control your thought, the less control you have. So it's not unlike a lot of things in life. A lot of things in life, the harder you try, the better you do, right? You know? If you've taken piano or whatever, or some musical instrument, you know you work really hard at it, keep practicing and practicing, the better you get. With mental control, the more you practice, the worse you get, right? And it reminds me of the time when I played baseball as a kid. I was in Little League, and I was not very good, I must say. I was probably average to slightly above average. I could run, but I couldn't really hit very well. But every once in a while, we would have a big game. And I was okay in practice. I could actually hit the ball. I could actually get a run or two in practice. But when it came to the big game, I choked really bad. I struck out every time. So what was going on? Well, what was going on is I really wanted to hit. I wanted to get a home run. And I was trying really hard. But the harder I tried, the more I choked. And mental control is a bit like that. If the thought really bothers you, and you think it's really significant, and you try really hard not to think about it, what happens? You think about it, right? You think about it even more. So that's the paradox. More effort leads to less control. So there's this relationship then between the unwanted and unacceptable intrusion and effort for control. So what do we mean by control? Well, there are various control strategies that people can use. And the strategies I have here in bold are the ones that we think are somewhat effective. And this comes from some of the thought suppression literature, which is the usual way that people kind of move on from having a troubling thought or whatever, is they think about something else, thought replacement, kind of cognitive distraction, right? They just, okay, there's that, and then they think of something else. The other thing you might do is a behavioral distraction. You might get yourself involved in an activity, and you accept the thought. You say, okay, there it is, and some of the acceptance and mindfulness work that's being done now shows effectiveness. The other control strategies, though, are probably not particularly effective, right? And in fact, attentively analyzing the thought may not be a particularly good thing to do, and even cognitive restructuring. And that's why I have question marks there. We're not quite sure about this, but it may be that that's not the way to deal with an unwanted intrusive thought. So trying to ask yourself, well, what's the evidence? And, like I have people in my practice, they get upset about sexual orientation, and they wonder, am I gay or am I straight or whatever it is, right? The opposite orientation to what they are. And so then they go, well, what's the evidence? Well, that's deadly. That's deadly if you start asking yourself, what's the evidence for this or for that or something? Often it makes the thought worse. So there are many instances in which cognitive restructuring may be less effective. We've got a little bit of data on this, and this is a little study I did several years ago with a graduate student, which was the classic thought suppression study, the white bear study, which is don't think about, think about it and then don't think about it. And in this case, we had a small sample of students, and half the group were asked to not think about failing an exam, and the other group were asked to think about failing the exam, right? So that's kind of expression group, think of failing the exam, and the suppression group, don't think of failing the exam. This was, oops, there's a typo there, interval 1. There was the express group here and the suppression group here. And in interval 2, everybody just monitored their thoughts. The outcome variable in this study was not the number of intrusions, but it was the number of seconds that people had the intrusive thought, because you could have one thought that lasts for 5 seconds and so on. And what was particularly interesting, we got a significant difference, which is the group that suppressed on interval 2, they had significantly longer intrusion times than the express group. They had significantly less intrusion times. So what this suggests is that if you accept the thought, we could say, express it, whatever you want to say, let it stay in your mind, fewer intrusions. If you try to push it out, more intrusions, more effort to get rid of the thought, you actually have more of the thought. This is a different, another study that we did a while ago, another grad student. And what this one is a slightly different paradigm. It's not the thought suppression paradigm, that this is a thought dismissal paradigm where you ask to think about a particular type of thought, hold it in your mind for 30 seconds or whatever, and then not to think about it. And so that's what we mean by dismissal. In this particular case, people were to either think of a distressing intrusive thought or a neutral thought. And so, yeah, a personal, repetitive, negative thought there. That's what PRD. I think it's depressive, actually, a personally repetitive, depressing thought. And what half the group were asked to signal when the thought kind of started to fade from their mind, and another, which we called lenient criteria, and the other group, we said, press the buzzer when you're absolutely certain the thought is completely out of your mind. Of course, when you press the buzzer, then you think about it, which of course. But that's not the point. We're not too concerned about that. So we have strict and lenient. And look what happens when you use a strict criteria is, of course, it takes much longer to feel like you've dismissed the thought. So this then opens up the possibility when people have trouble with their unwanted intrusive thoughts, is it possible that they're using different criteria to when they've controlled the thought? If you have a strict criteria of control, you know, the thought must be completely out of my mind. And this is what happens with repugnant obsessions, right? You don't want even the slightest, you know, like the thought in the back of your mind type thing. You know, people say, well, it's kind of back there. I can think of other things, but I know it's back there. You know, if your criteria is it can't even be in the back of your mind, then of course you're going to struggle greatly with thought control. And this is some interesting data from you can see several years ago. This is a meta-analysis that was done by McGee, Harden, and Bethany Teachman. And what's interesting about this meta-analysis is that they were looking at thought suppression data over these different clinical groups, because there are hundreds of thought suppression studies. So there was enough to look at what happens with thought suppression in an OCD group, in a PTSD group, in a GAD group, and so on. And what's particularly interesting about this is, the other thing is they divided it into analyzing the initial enhancement effect. That is, if you tell the group to suppress the thought, immediately they have more intrusions than the don't suppress group. And the rebound effect is that you suppress in interval 1 and you get a rebound or more intrusions in interval 2. But what is particularly interesting to me about this is the OCD group. And the OCD group was actually better at suppressing the thought. They have more control over their thoughts than other clinical groups, which of course is contrary to what you would expect. So here we find it may not be the actual control you have over the thought, but how much control you think you have over the thought that's critical. So what are the clinical implications? Well, I've got a couple of minutes left on that. The first thing is we can put all this together and suggest some kind of a model that we could use that would be kind of more like a transdiagnostic model. This makes sense to OCD. It could be applied to PTSD. It could be applied to any clinical disorder where people have intrusive thoughts, unwanted thoughts, and so on. And so you can see up here at the top, we all have mental intrusions, right? That's normal. It's how the brain operates. You can't not have intrusive thoughts. But what immediately is most important is how you appraise the thought in terms of its significance. If you are convinced the thought really isn't of any great significance to you, it's kind of neutral or whatever, no personal significance, then probably your mental control will drop. You're not going to necessarily try to control it because it's insignificant thought. Your attentional, it's given reduced attentional priority, and you can distract yourself with another cognition. And you don't feel distressed. But of course, this other route is the more clinical route, where you appraise the thought as significant. This drives up your mental control effort, and now, of course, you're paying a great deal of attention to it. Then this kicks into play some associated negative cognitions. It could be worry, it could be rumination, it could be negative automatic thoughts, self-criticism, and so on. And we see elevations in distress. So what we want to do is we want to reduce the significance of the thought. Thank you. We want to normalize the intrusion. We want to use different types of exposures to the intrusion and its triggers. We want to use focused distraction and possibly absorption activities and mindful observation and detachment. All of these are different types of interventions that one could use to arrive at the goal, which is acceptance of the unwanted intrusive thought. This is the more clinical side of it. I'm going to try to go through this in about 2 minutes. This would be an illustration of how you might work with this idea of significance of intrusive thoughts and, or let's say anxious intrusive thoughts. So let's say we have anxious and non-anxious. What you do with a client is, first of all, you get them to articulate their anxious intrusive thought, whatever it is. And then you would ask them to select an intrusive thought that's negative but doesn't bother them, because we all have negative intrusive thoughts that don't bother us. So it might be something like, does my partner love me? Did I sound incompetent at the keynote? I wonder if I'm becoming ill. I mean, these are thoughts that pop into our mind. They could cause some anxiety, but they don't. And so you work with the client or the patient and say, well, why does one thought bother you and not the other? And so we can go through this kind of questioning protocol, is what is leading to the misinterpretation of personal significance? And these are some of the questions that you can ask. And let's say the anxious thought, which one of my OCD patients had, is, what if everything in life is a figment of my imagination? And so you go through this questioning, this inductive, kind of a cognitive interview of what makes this an anxious thought significant. And then you suggest, how do you think you could take your negative but non-anxious intrusive thought, how could you make yourself anxious? How do you think someone else might get anxious with that thought? And so then you can kind of go through. That's what I mean by false significance. And then you can construct a reappraisal protocol. How now do you think you could turn your anxious intrusive thought into a non-anxious intrusive thought? And you could use decatastrophizing, discover the benign or positive aspects. So for example, many times with my OCD patients, we work with the idea that, oh, these dark intrusive thoughts that you have could be a sign of creativity. Maybe it's a sign that you are a highly imaginative individual, and so on. And then, of course, we followed up with a homework assignment. There's the white bear, and these are various types of interventions that we use with intrusive thoughts. So I've gone over some of these in the workshop, so I won't belabor them here. I think some of them will be well known to you. These are kind of like you can do surveys on mental control. For example, you could have your patient do an alternate control day, where one day they really work hard at controlling the thought, and then the next day they just kind of let the thought go, and then see what the effects are of each of them. Even doing some mind wandering, allowing your mind to wander and allow intrusive thoughts in your mind can be helpful. So what's the conclusion in all this? The conclusion is this: unwanted intrusive thoughts are necessary. We need them. They're transdiagnostic. The negative, distressing, repetitive intrusive thoughts are clinically significant. But we have no choice. We need to have spontaneous thought. It's the appraisal of significance that really turns the intrusion into some kind of a toxic mental event or experience. And unwanted intrusive thoughts succumb to the mental control paradox, meaning that if our patients are trying hard not to have the thought, that's getting them into a great deal of trouble, because it means that their controllability will drop. And finally, to achieve therapeutic acceptance, we achieve therapeutic acceptance by normalizing the interpretation and helping our patients to let go or relinquish their mental control efforts. So that's it. So thank you, and there's some of what it's based on. And I want to also mention that there is the IACP conference in Rome, and I'm on the committee, so voila, you see the advertisement. Thank you very much.